Hello everyone. My name is Damian Cole. Today I'm going to share with you a story that still gives me chills every time I think about it. This is about the house my wife and I moved into last year. In Vermont, a house that seemed perfect from the outside, but held secrets that would change our lives forever. Before we begin, I noticed that about 80% of viewers didn't subscribe while watching my videos. If you're enjoying this content, please hit that subscribe button. Give this video a like. And don't forget to ring the bell icon for notifications. Also, I'd love to know where you're watching this from. Drop a comment below and tell me your country. I love hearing from all of you. Now, let me take you back to where it all started. It was September of last year when my wife Amanda and I decided to leave our cramped apartment in Boston and move to the quiet countryside of Vermont. We had been saving for years to buy our first house. And when we saw the listing for the Victorian home in Woodstock, we knew we had to see it. The house was built in 1894, 3 stories tall with beautiful bay windows and intricate woodwork that spoke of craftsmanship from a bygone era. It sat on 4 acres of land, surrounded by maple and oak trees that were just beginning to turn brilliant shades of orange and red. The asking price was surprisingly reasonable, which should have been our first warning. When we met the real estate agent, a nervous woman named Ivy Harrison, she seemed eager to close the deal quickly. She mentioned that the previous owners had moved out rather suddenly. Something about a job relocation to the West Coast. But she was vague about the details. Amanda and I were so excited about the space and the price that we didn't press for more information. The house tour revealed spacious rooms with high ceilings, hardwood floors that creaked pleasantly underfoot, and windows that let in streams of golden afternoon light. The kitchen had been recently updated with modern appliances, and the master bedroom on the 2nd floor had a beautiful view of the surrounding forest. There was even a 3rd floor that the previous owners had used as an office space, complete with built-in bookshelves and a small fireplace. We made an offer that same day, and it was accepted immediately. In fact, Ivy seemed almost relieved when we signed the paperwork, as if she had been waiting for months to get rid of this property. Moving day arrived in early October. The leaves were in full autumn splendor, creating a picturesque backdrop as the moving truck pulled up our long gravel driveway. Amanda was practically glowing with happiness as we carried boxes into our new home. She kept talking about all the decorating plans she had, how we could turn the 3rd floor into a guest room, maybe even start a family in a house with so much room to grow. The first few days were blissful. We spent our time unpacking, arranging furniture, and exploring our new property. The woods behind the house were peaceful and inviting, perfect for morning walks with our dog Charlie, a golden retriever we had adopted just before the move. We met a few neighbors who seemed friendly enough, though they all made similar comments about how glad they were that someone was living in the house again. "Been empty for almost 2 years," said Emress Helen Murphy, our elderly neighbor to the east. "The Hendersons who lived there before you. Lovely family, but they left so suddenly. Nobody really knows why. It wasn't until our 4th night that we first heard them. The footsteps. I was lying in bed. Amanda curled up beside me, when I heard what sounded like someone walking around upstairs. Slow, deliberate steps that seemed to move from one end of the 3rd floor to the other. At first, I assumed it was just the old house settling. Victorian homes are known for their creaks and groans, especially when the temperature drops at night in New England. But the footsteps were too rhythmic, too purposeful to be random settling. They had a distinctly human quality. the measured pace of someone deep in thought, pacing back and forth across the wooden floor above our heads. "Amanda," I whispered, gently shaking my wife's shoulder. "Do you hear that?" She stirred, listening for a moment before sitting up. Her auburn hair was messy from sleep, but her green eyes were alert and focused. "What's that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. We both lay there in silence, listening to the steady pace of footsteps directly above our bedroom. Back and forth they went, like someone pacing in distress or deep contemplation. The sound would continue for maybe 10 minutes, then stop abruptly, leaving us in an almost oppressive silence that seemed to press down on us like physical weight. "Maybe it's mice," Amanda suggested, though her voice lacked conviction. "Or squirrels in the attic. Old houses like this, they probably have all sorts of small animals living in the walls." I wanted to believe her, but deep down I knew that no animal moved with such regular, human-like steps. These weren't the scurrying sounds of rodents or the scratching of claws on wood. These were the deliberate footfalls of a person walking back and forth, as if trapped in an endless loop of restless energy. The next morning, I climbed up to the 3rd floor to investigate. The room was exactly as we had left it. Boxes stacked along the walls, dust motes dancing in the sunbeams streaming through the tall windows. I examined every inch of the floor, looking for signs of animal droppings or damage, but found nothing. The floorboards were solid, showing no signs of pest intrusion or structural problems. What I did notice, however, was how cold the room felt, even with the morning sun streaming through the windows. There was a distinct chill in the air, as if the room existed in a different season than the rest of the house. I checked the windows for drafts, examined the fireplace for loose dampers, but could find no logical explanation for the temperature difference. That evening, we heard them again. Same time, same pattern. Amanda gripped my hand as we listened to the invisible presence above us. This time, the footsteps seemed to pause directly over our bed, as if someone was standing there, listening to us the same way we were listening to them. The silence during these pauses was absolute, so complete that I could hear my own heartbeat thundering in my ears. "We need to call an exterminator," Amanda said the next morning, though her suggestion sounded more like a plea than a practical solution. Dark circles had already begun to form under her eyes, and I noticed she jumped slightly at every small sound in the house. I agreed, more to ease her mind than because I thought it would solve anything. The exterminator, a gruff man named Cole Matthews from the local pest control company, arrived that afternoon. He spent 2 hours examining every inch of the house, from the stone foundation in the basement to the rafters in the attic. "I'm not finding any evidence of animal activity," he reported, shaking his head as he packed up his equipment. "No droppings, no nesting materials, no gnaw marks, no entry points. If you've got something living up there, it's not leaving the usual signs. And to be honest, I've been doing this for 25 years, and I've never seen animals create patterns like the footprints you're describing." That revelation sent a chill down my spine. "Footprints?" I asked. "What footprints?" Cole looked uncomfortable. "Well, there's a thin layer of dust on that 3rd floor, and there are definitely impressions in it. Looks like someone's been walking back and forth up there. But the strange thing is, they're not complete footprints. More like partial impressions, as if someone was walking but not quite touching the ground that night." as if to mock his professional assessment. The footsteps returned with renewed vigor. They seemed louder, more insistent than before. The pacing pattern had changed too. Instead of the measured back and forth we had grown accustomed to, tonight the steps seemed to follow a more complex route, moving in what sounded like a rectangle around the perimeter of the room, then cutting across the center in diagonal lines, as if someone was searching for something. Or perhaps trying to escape from something. Amanda was becoming increasingly agitated. She had always been a light sleeper, and the nightly disturbances were taking their toll. The dark circles under her eyes had deepened, and she jumped at every small noise during the day. She started suggesting we call the previous owners. Maybe ask them if they had ever experienced anything similar. But Ivy, our real estate agent, claimed she had lost contact with the Hendersons. They had apparently moved to California, she said, and hadn't left forwarding information. This seemed increasingly strange to me. What family moves across the country without leaving some way to be reached? And why had Ivy been so eager to close the deal if there was nothing wrong with the property? By the second week, the footsteps had become a nightly routine, always starting around 11:30 p.m., lasting anywhere from 10 minutes to an hour. Sometimes they would pause for long minutes, creating moments of hopeful silence, only to resume just as we began to relax. It was psychological torture, and I could see it wearing on both of us. Amanda had started taking sleeping pills, but even those couldn't drown out the sound of those persistent footsteps. I decided to take more decisive action. One evening, just as the footsteps began, I grabbed a flashlight and my phone to record audio and headed for the stairs. Amanda called after me, her voice filled with concern. But I was determined to confront whatever was causing these disturbances. Damien, please don't go up there. What if there really is someone in our house? Her words stopped me cold. I hadn't considered the possibility that we might be dealing with an actual intruder, someone who had been living in our attic without our knowledge. The thought was almost more terrifying than a supernatural explanation. But I pressed on. The third floor was pitch black when I reached it. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing the familiar sight of our storage boxes and the few pieces of furniture we had placed there. But now, in the darkness, the room felt different. Hostile somehow. The air was not just cold. It was bitter, like stepping into a walk-in freezer. The footsteps had stopped the moment I entered the room, but I could feel a presence. Something watching me from the shadows beyond my flashlight's reach. The silence was not peaceful. It was expectant, as if whatever shared this space with us was waiting to see what I would do next. I stood perfectly still, straining my ears for any sound, any clue about what might be sharing this space with us. My breath came out in visible puffs in the frigid air, and I could feel goosebumps rising on my arms despite the warm October weather outside. Then I heard it, a soft scraping sound, like fingernails being dragged across wood. It was coming from a far corner of the room, near an old armoire that had been left by the previous owners. The sound was rhythmic, deliberate, like someone was carving something into the wooden surface. I moved toward the sound, my flashlight trembling slightly in my grip. Each step seemed to echo unnaturally in the cold air, and the scraping sound grew louder, more urgent, as if whatever was making it knew I was approaching. As I got closer to the armoire, the scraping stopped. The silence that followed was absolute, oppressive, I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. Could feel sweat beading on my forehead despite the cold. I reached for the armoire door, my hand shaking as I grasped the old brass handle. The door swung open with a prolonged creak that seemed to echo through the entire house, revealing nothing but empty space and the musty smell of old wood. But as I peered inside, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There were fresh scratches on the inside of the armoire, deep gouges in the wood that looked like they had been made recently. The marks formed a pattern, almost like letters, but too rough and frantic to read clearly. I backed away from the armoire, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. The temperature in the room seemed to drop even further, and my breath began to mist heavily in the suddenly Arctic air. The smell of the room changed too, from musty wood to something else, something that reminded me of wet earth and decay. That's when I heard Amanda scream from downstairs. I ran, taking the stairs 2 at a time, my flashlight beam bouncing wildly as I descended. I found her in our bedroom, pressed against the far wall, pointing at the window with a shaking hand. Her face was white with terror, and she was trembling uncontrollably. "There was someone outside," she gasped, her voice barely above a whisper, "standing under the oak tree, just watching the house." When I looked directly at them, they stepped back into the shadows. But Damien, they weren't. They weren't solid. I could see the tree trunk through them. I rushed to the window, but saw only the dark outline of trees swaying in the autumn wind. If someone had been there, solid or otherwise, they were gone now. But Amanda was not the type to imagine things, and the absolute terror in her eyes was completely real. Whatever she had seen had shaken her to her core. That night, neither of us slept. We huddled together in bed, listening to every creak, every whisper of wind against the windows. The footsteps didn't return, but somehow their absence was even more unsettling than their presence had been. It felt like the calm before a storm, as if whatever was in our house was gathering strength for something bigger. The next morning, I called in sick to work and drove into Woodstock to do some research. The local library had a surprisingly comprehensive collection of historical records, and I was determined to learn more about our house and its previous inhabitants. The librarian, a kind elderly woman named M.R.S. Patricia Stone, was incredibly helpful, pulling out boxes of old newspapers, property records, and local history books. What I discovered made my stomach turn. The house had a history, a dark one that IVY had conveniently failed to mention. In 1923, a family named the Weatherbys had lived there. Harold Weatherby, his wife Elizabeth, and their 8-year-old daughter Emily. The little girl had gone missing one winter night, simply vanished from her bedroom on the 2nd floor. Search parties scoured the woods for weeks, but no trace of her was ever found. The official investigation concluded that she had likely wandered outside and become lost in the woods, eventually succumbing to the harsh Vermont winter. But there were rumors, whispers in the community that Harold Weatherby had been acting strangely in the months before his daughter's disappearance. Neighbors reported hearing arguments from the house, violent shouting matches that would go on for hours, and several people claimed to have seen him burying something in the woods behind the property. No charges were ever filed, but the family left town shortly after the investigation was closed. The house sat empty for several years before being sold to new owners. But that wasn't the end of the story. Over the decades, the house had changed hands multiple times, and each family that lived there reported similar experiences. Footsteps in the night. Cold spots throughout the house. The feeling of being watched. Objects moving on their own. Most families didn't last more than a year before moving away. Some leaving so suddenly that they abandoned furniture and personal belongings. I found records of at least 8 different families who had lived in the house since the Weatherbys. All had left under similar circumstances. Citing disturbances and unexplained phenomena, the most recent owners before us. The Hendersons had lived there for only 6 months before packing up and leaving in the middle of the night. According to neighbors, they had seemed terrified, refusing to talk about why they were leaving so suddenly. But the most disturbing discovery came when I found a police report from 1987. A family named the Douglases had been living in the house when their 5-year-old son Michael went missing. He had been playing in the backyard one afternoon. His mother had gone inside for just a few minutes to answer the phone, and when she came back out, he was gone, despite extensive searches. The boy was never found. The family moved away within a week. Armed with this information, I drove to the newspaper office and requested to speak with someone who might remember more details about these cases. The current editor was too young, but he referred me to Robert Chin, a retired journalist who had covered local news for over 40 years. Robert lived in a small cottage on the outskirts of town, surrounded by gardens that had clearly been his passion for many years. He invited me in for coffee, and when I mentioned the Weatherby house, his expression immediately grew serious. "That place," he said, shaking his head sadly. "I've been waiting for someone to ask about that house for years. Too many families. Too many children. Something's not right there. Never has been. Tell me about Emily Weatherby," I said. Robert's eyes grew distant. Beautiful little girl. Had these bright green eyes and curly blonde hair that caught the sunlight. Always carrying around this old rag doll her grandmother had made for her. Molly, she called it. Never went anywhere without that doll. What do you think really happened to her? Robert glanced around nervously before leaning closer. Off the record, I always suspected the father. Harold Weatherby was a strange man. Worked as a carpenter, but he had a temper, especially when he'd been drinking. There were reports of domestic disturbances. Neighbors calling about shouting and crying coming from that house. But Elizabeth always covered for him. Made excuses. Said he was just stressed about work. But nothing was ever proven. Nothing could be proven. The body was never found. And without physical evidence, the police couldn't make an arrest. But I'll tell you something. I was one of the reporters covering that search. And I spent days in those woods. There are places back there. Old root cellars and abandoned wells from homesteads that were there before the Weatherby house was built. Places where something could be hidden and never found. He paused, taking a sip of his coffee before continuing. But what really bothers me is the pattern. Emily Weatherby in 1923. Michael Douglas in 1987. And there were others. Children who went missing from that property. The official records might not connect them all, but I've kept my own files over the years. 7 children. Damien. 7 children have disappeared from that house over the past century. I left Robert's house with a heavy heart and a manila folder full of photocopied articles and reports. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to come together, and I didn't like the picture they were forming. A house that seemed to attract families with young children, only to see those children disappear without a trace. Was this some kind of supernatural predator, or was there a more earthly explanation? Some human monster who had been using the house's reputation to cover his crimes? That evening, I shared my discoveries with Amanda. She listened in horrified silence as I recounted the tragic history of our new home. By the time I finished, she was in tears. "We have to leave," she whispered. "We can't stay here knowing what might happen. What might be happening right now?" But even as she spoke, we both knew it wasn't that simple. We had invested our life savings in this house, taken out a 30-year mortgage that would consume most of our income for decades to come. We couldn't just walk away, not without losing everything we had worked for. "Maybe we can help them," I suggested, though I wasn't sure I believed my own words. "If Emily and the others are still here, maybe they need someone to find out what really happened to them. Maybe they need justice." Amanda stared at me as if I had lost my mind. "You want to investigate murders that happened decades ago, Damien? We're not detectives. We're just two people who wanted a nice house in the country. How are we supposed to solve cases that the police couldn't crack?" But something inside me had awakened. A need to know the truth. To give those lost children the justice they had been denied for so long. I couldn't explain it, but I felt connected to this mystery in a way that went beyond mere curiosity. It was as if the house itself was calling on me to uncover its secrets. That night, the footsteps returned with a vengeance. But this time, I was ready for them. I had positioned a digital recorder on the 3rd floor, hoping to capture evidence of what we were experiencing. As the familiar pacing began above our bedroom, I lay still and listened, trying to detect any variation in the pattern. The footsteps seemed different tonight, more urgent, as if responding to my newfound knowledge about the house's history. They moved in tight circles now, concentrated in one area of the room, directly above where Amanda and I slept. It was as if whatever was up there was trying to draw our attention to a specific location. Around midnight, the pacing stopped, replaced by a new sound that made my blood freeze. It was crying, the soft, heartbroken weeping of a child. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, filling the house with grief so profound that I felt tears beginning to form in my own eyes. But this wasn't just one child crying. As I listened more carefully, I could distinguish multiple voices, different ages, different tones, but all expressing the same inconsolable sorrow. It was the sound of lost children, children who had been taken from their families, from their lives, from their futures. Amanda was awake too, gripping my arm so tightly that her nails dug into my skin. We lay there listening to the saddest sound either of us had ever heard. The collective weeping of innocents who had been denied the chance to grow up, to live their lives, to experience all the joy and wonder that childhood should hold. The crying continued for nearly 2 hours, gradually fading until it was just a whisper. Then silence, but the emotional impact lingered, filling our bedroom with a sense of overwhelming sorrow that seemed to seep into our very souls. We both understood now that we weren't just dealing with restless spirits. We were dealing with the victims of unspeakable crimes. "They're here," Amanda whispered into the darkness. "All of them. Emily, Michael, all the children who disappeared from this house. They're really here." I nodded, unable to speak. The reality of our situation had finally hit home. We weren't just dealing with settling floorboards or nocturnal animals. We were sharing our home with the spirits of murdered children, little ones who were still searching for justice, still crying out for someone to care enough to find the truth. The next day, I made a decision that would change everything. I was going to search the woods behind our house. If those children were buried somewhere on the property, I was going to find them. It was the only way I could think of to put their spirits at rest. and possibly restore some peace to our home. I started early in the morning, armed with a metal detector I had borrowed from a friend and several shovels from our garage. Amanda wanted to help, but I convinced her to stay in the house with Charlie, our dog, who had been acting increasingly nervous, whimpering and refusing to go near certain areas of the property. The woods were beautiful in the morning light, golden leaves carpeting the ground, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was walking through a graveyard. The metal detector remained mostly silent as I worked, occasionally beeping at bottle caps or old nails, but nothing significant. Hours passed, and I began to wonder if I was wasting my time. Then, about a quarter-mile behind the house, I found something that made me stop dead in my tracks. It was a small clearing where the trees grew in an unusual pattern, forming almost a perfect circle around a patch of bare ground. The earth here looked different, slightly sunken as if it had been disturbed long ago and had settled over time. My metal detector began to beep erratically as I swept it over this area. Not the sharp, consistent tone that indicated metal, but a confused, fluctuating signal that suggested something was interfering with the device's operation. I had heard about this phenomenon before, how spiritual energy could affect electronic equipment. I began to dig. The soil was soft, much softer than it should have been after decades of weather and settling. As I worked, I found fragments of what looked like old fabric, rotted and discolored but still recognizable as cloth. My heart was pounding as I continued to excavate, knowing that I might be disturbing a grave. Then, about 2 feet down, my shovel struck something that made my blood run cold. It wasn't wood. It wasn't stone. It was the unmistakable curve of a human skull. Small, delicate, clearly that of a child. I sat back on my heels, staring at my discovery. This was it. This was where one of the missing children had been buried, hidden in the woods behind their own home, placed in a shallow grave that had kept their secret for decades. But as I continued to carefully excavate, I realized this wasn't just one grave. The bones I was uncovering belonged to multiple individuals, multiple children, all buried together in this unmarked plot. The full horror of what had happened at our house was beginning to reveal itself. I didn't disturb the remains further. Instead, I carefully covered everything back up and returned to the house to call the authorities. This was now a police matter, a crime scene that needed to be properly investigated. Amanda was waiting for me when I returned, her face pale with anxiety. "Did you find anything?" she asked. I nodded, unable to speak for a moment. "I found them," I finally managed to say. "I found the children." The police arrived within an hour, followed by the state medical examiner and a team of forensic investigators. I led them to the site, and they immediately established a perimeter around the area. What followed was a careful, methodical excavation that took the better part of a week. The remains they recovered were indeed those of multiple children, 7 in total, all approximately between the ages of 5 and 10. The forensic anthropologist who examined the bones found evidence of trauma on several of the skeletons, indicating that death had not been natural. Though they couldn't determine the exact cause of death after so many years, the circumstances strongly suggested foul play. Along with the remains, they found fragments of clothing, a few small personal items, and most heartbreakingly, the remnants of toys, a handmade doll with a ceramic head, building blocks, a small wooden horse. These were the treasured possessions of children who had been robbed of the chance to grow up. The discovery made national news. A century-long mystery had finally been solved. 7 missing children had been found, all buried together in a mass grave behind the house where they had once lived. The investigation was officially reopened. Though with all the original suspects long dead, there would be no arrests, no trial, no earthly justice for the children who had been murdered. But something unexpected happened after the remains were discovered and given proper burial in the Woodstock Cemetery. The footsteps stopped. For the first time in weeks. Amanda and I slept through the night without disturbance. The oppressive atmosphere in the house began to lift, replaced by something that felt almost like peace. The cold spots disappeared. The strange sound ceased, and the feeling of being watched gradually faded away. It was as if the children had been waiting all these years for someone to find them, to give them the dignity of a proper burial and acknowledgement of what had happened to them. Now that their remains had been discovered and their story told, they were finally able to rest. But the investigation had also uncovered something else, something that would rock our small Vermont community to its core. The forensic team had found evidence in the basement of our house, hidden beneath the stone foundation, that suggested the murders had been committed by someone who had lived in the house for an extended period. Someone who had used the property as their base of operations for decades. Among the evidence was a collection of personal items belonging to the children, kept as trophies by their killer. There were photographs, locks of hair, small pieces of clothing, all carefully preserved in a makeshift shrine hidden behind a false wall in the basement. The dates on some of the items suggested that the murders had continued sporadically from the 1920s well into the 1990s. Most shocking of all was the discovery of detailed journals, written in a spidery handwriting, that documented each murder in horrific detail. The journals revealed that the killer had been Harold Weatherby, Emily's own father. But his crimes hadn't ended with his family. He had continued living in the house after murdering his wife and daughter, luring other families to the property and killing their children, using the house's growing reputation for being haunted to explain away the disappearances. Harold had lived in the house until his death in 1996. An old man who had spent over 70 years murdering children and hiding their bodies in the woods behind his home. He had died alone, his crimes undiscovered, his victims forgotten. But their spirits had remained, trapped in the house where they had suffered, waiting for justice, waiting for someone to care enough to find the truth. The community was devastated by these revelations. Families who had lost children decades earlier finally had answers. But those answers brought little comfort. Knowing that their loved ones had been murdered by a monster who had lived among them for so long. 7 families who had spent years wondering, hoping, praying for news of their missing children, finally learned the truth. But it was a truth too horrible to bear. The proper burial of all 7 children took place on a beautiful autumn day, just as the leaves were reaching their peak colors. The entire community came out for the service. People who had never known the children but felt connected to their story. The cemetery plot we purchased was large enough for all of them, with individual headstones bearing their names and the simple inscription, "Finally home, Emily Weatherby, Michael Douglas, Sarah Collins, Timothy Wright, Jennifer Stone, David Murphy, Rachel Anderson." 7 children whose lives had been cut short, whose families had never known what happened to them, who had been forgotten by everyone except the spirits that remained in the house where they died. That night, for the first time since we had moved into the house, the silence was complete. No footsteps. No cold spots. No feeling of being watched. The children had finally found peace. And with it, they had given us the peace we had been seeking as well. But our story doesn't end there. Because a few weeks after the burial, something wonderful happened. Amanda discovered she was pregnant. After years of trying unsuccessfully to start a family, we were finally going to have a child of our own. It was as if the house, freed from its dark history, was ready to welcome new life, to be filled with the laughter of children once again. The pregnancy progressed normally, and 9 months later, we welcomed a beautiful baby girl into the world. We named her Hope, because that's what she represented. Hope for the future. Hope for healing. Hope that love could triumph over the darkest evil. Our daughter is now 8 months old, and she is the light of our lives. The house that once felt haunted now feels blessed, filled with laughter and joy instead of sorrow and fear. Sometimes, when I'm sitting in the nursery during late-night feedings, I swear I can feel a gentle presence watching over us. Not malevolent or frightening, but protective and loving. I believe the 7 children are still here in some way, but not as tortured spirits crying out for justice. Now they're guardian angels, watching over the daughter who represents new life in a house that knew too much death, ensuring that no harm will ever come to another child in this place. The woods behind our home have become a place of peace rather than dread. Amanda and I often walk there in the evenings, pushing little Hope in her stroller. And we always pause at the memorial we've created where the children were found. 7 small stone markers surrounded by flowers that bloom in a continuous cycle, ensuring that their memory remains alive throughout all seasons. The house itself has become something of a pilgrimage site for people interested in true crime and historical mysteries. But rather than treat it as a tourist attraction, Amanda and I have opened our doors to serious researchers and law enforcement officials, sharing our story and the lessons we learned about the importance of never giving up on missing children, never accepting that some mysteries are unsolvable. We established a foundation in the children's names, dedicated to investigating cold cases involving missing children. Using the insurance settlement we received after the house was declared a crime scene, we've been able to fund several investigations that have led to the discovery of other missing children. Other families finally getting the closure they deserve. Amanda has started a support group for families of missing children. People come from all over New England to attend the meetings we host in our home. They find comfort in knowing that even after decades, even when all hope seems lost, the truth can still be discovered. Justice can still be served. As little Hope grows, she displays an unusual sensitivity to the history of our home. At 8 months old, she sometimes stares at empty corners and smiles, as if she can see things we cannot. She's never frightened by these invisible presences, which tells us that whatever remains of the 7 children is benevolent, protective, loving. The local community has embraced our family as heroes, people who solved one of the region's oldest and most horrific mysteries. Property values throughout the neighborhood have actually increased, not because people are afraid of ghosts, but because they're drawn to a place where justice was finally served, where truth triumphed over secrecy, where the innocent found peace at last. But perhaps the most significant change has been in us. Amanda and I have been transformed by this experience. We've learned that some mysteries are too important to ignore, that some voices from the past are too crucial to silence. We've discovered that ordinary people, when faced with extraordinary circumstances, can accomplish extraordinary things. The house continues to evolve as our daughter grows. Rooms that once felt cold and unwelcoming have become warm and inviting. The third floor, where we first heard those mysterious footsteps, has been converted into a playroom where Hope will spend hours as she gets older, playing games, reading books, filling the space with the sounds of childhood that have been absent for too long. Sometimes people ask us if we ever regret buying this house, if we wish we had known about its history before we moved in. The answer is always no. We were meant to be here, meant to uncover the truth about those 7 children, meant to give them the peace they deserved, and meant to raise our own daughter in a place where she will grow up understanding that every person matters, that every story deserves to be told, and that love is stronger than fear. The third floor now serves as Little Hope's sanctuary, a place where she crawls around exploring every corner with the fearless curiosity that only babies possess. But as she grows stronger and more mobile, we've begun to notice something that both fascinates and unnerves us. Hope seems drawn to specific areas of the room, places where she will sit quietly for long periods, staring at empty space with the kind of focused attention that suggests she's seeing something we cannot. When we move her toys to different parts of the room, she inevitably crawls back to these same spots, as if invisible hands are guiding her there. Amanda initially dismissed this as normal baby behavior, but I've started documenting these occurrences, noting the times, the locations, and Hope's reactions. What I've discovered is that her favorite spots correspond exactly with the areas where the footsteps were most concentrated during those first terrifying weeks. It's as if the children are still there, not as frightening presences, but as gentle guardians watching over our daughter. Dr. Margaret Lewis, Hope's pediatrician, assured us that babies often appear to see things that aren't there due to their developing vision and neural pathways. But she couldn't explain why Hope never cries or seems frightened in these moments. Instead, she coos and giggles as if playing with invisible friends, reaching out with her tiny hands toward empty air, her face lighting up with pure joy. One evening in late spring, when Hope was about 10 months old, Amanda and I were having dinner when we heard something that made us both freeze. It was the sound of children laughing, not crying or wailing as we had heard before, but genuine, happy laughter coming from the third floor. We rushed upstairs expecting to find Hope in distress, but instead discovered her sitting in the center of the room, clapping her hands and laughing along with voices only she could hear. The sight was both beautiful and deeply moving. Here was our daughter, surrounded by the spirits of children who had never had the chance to play as she was playing, never had the opportunity to experience the simple joy of childhood games. Yet somehow they had found a way to connect with her, to share in her innocence and wonder. Amanda began to cry, not from fear but from overwhelming emotion. "They're playing with her," she whispered. "Those poor children. They're finally getting to play again." From that night forward, we stopped seeing these occurrences as supernatural phenomena and started viewing them as healing, both for the spirits of the children and for our own family. The house was teaching us something profound about the connection between past and present, about how love and innocence can transcend even death. As Hope approached her first birthday, we decided to throw her a party in the house, inviting family and friends to celebrate not just her life, but the new chapter that had begun for all of us. We decorated the main floor with balloons and streamers, prepared a small cake with 1 candle, and gathered everyone in the living room where so much sorrow had once dwelled. But the most remarkable moment came when we were all singing happy birthday to Hope. As our voices filled the room, we heard something that took our breath away. Other voices joining in, faint but unmistakably there. Children's voices harmonizing with ours, singing along to celebrate the first birthday of a little girl who represented everything they had been denied. Our guests couldn't hear the additional voices, but Amanda and I exchanged knowing looks. We both understood that the 7 children were participating in this celebration, finding joy in Hope's milestones, living vicariously through her experiences. It was their gift to her, and hers to them. After the party, as we were cleaning up, our neighbor MRS, Murphy, stopped by to help. She's in her 80s now, and her memory isn't what it used to be. But something about the atmosphere in our house that day seemed to awaken forgotten recollections. You know, she said, pausing in her sweeping, I remember when the Henderson family lived here. They had a little boy about Hope's age. Jacob, I think his name was. Sweet child, always waving at me from the upstairs window. But toward the end, before they moved away so suddenly, Elizabeth Henderson told me something strange. Amanda and I stopped what we were doing, giving MRS, Murphy, our full attention. Any information about previous residents might help us understand the full scope of what had happened in our house. She said Jacob had started talking about his new friends, invisible friends who would play with him in his room. At first she thought it was normal childhood imagination, but then he started describing them in such detail. Their names, their ages, the clothes they wore. Clothes that sounded like they were from different time periods. My blood ran cold as I realized what MRS, Murphy, was describing. Did she say anything else about these friends? Well, this is the strange part. Jacob told his mother that his friends were sad because they missed their families. He said they couldn't leave the house because someone had hurt them, and they were waiting for someone to help them go home. MRS. Murphy paused, her weathered hands gripping the broom handle. Elizabeth thought it was just stories at first. But then Jacob started having nightmares, screaming about a scary man who lived in the basement, a man who hurt children. Amanda gasped, covering her mouth with her hand. We both understood now why the Hendersons had left so suddenly. Their son had somehow made contact with the spirits of the murdered children, had learned about Harold Weatherby and his crimes, but being too young to process such horrific information, it had manifested as nightmares and terror. The night before they moved, MRS. Murphy continued, I saw Elizabeth loading suitcases into their car. She was crying, and when I asked if everything was all right, she just looked at me with these haunted eyes and said, This house knows too much. Children shouldn't have to carry the weight of such terrible secrets. This revelation made us realize how fortunate we were. Hope was still too young to form detailed memories of her interactions with the spirits. When she grew older, she would likely remember this time as nothing more than vague impressions of warmth and protection. She wouldn't carry the burden of knowing the tragic details of what had happened to the children who watched over her. But it also made us more determined than ever to ensure that justice continued to be served. The Henderson family had fled because they couldn't handle the truth, but we were committed to staying and helping others find closure. Over the months following Hope's first birthday, more families began reaching out to us. People who had lost children in similar circumstances. Cold cases that had never been solved. We partnered with a forensic anthropologist named Dr. Susan Clark, who specialized in historical crime scenes. Together, we developed a protocol for investigating properties with similar histories, looking for patterns that might indicate other burial sites, other families of victims who deserved answers. Our first successful case came 6 months later. An old farmhouse in New Hampshire where 3 children had disappeared over a span of 40 years. Using ground-penetrating radar and the techniques we had learned from our own experience, we helped local authorities discover a burial site that had been hidden for decades. 3 families finally got the closure they had been seeking, and 3 more children were given proper burials. The success of this investigation led to media attention that we hadn't anticipated. Suddenly, our phone was ringing constantly with requests from families, journalists, and law enforcement agencies. Amanda and I found ourselves becoming reluctant experts in a field we had never intended to enter. But with each case we helped solve, we felt a deeper sense of purpose. This wasn't just about our house anymore. It was about giving voice to victims who had been silenced, about refusing to let time erase the memory of innocent lives that had been taken too soon. Hope seemed to thrive on the positive energy that our work brought to the house. As she learned to walk and then to run, she would toddle through the rooms where we held meetings with investigators and victim families, bringing smiles to people who had forgotten how to hope. Her laughter became a healing sound for parents who hadn't heard their own children laugh in years or decades. One particularly meaningful moment came when the mother of Jennifer Stone, one of the 7 children we had found, visited our house for the first time since her daughter's funeral. MRS. Carol Stone had aged considerably in the months since learning her daughter's fate. But when Hope crawled over to her and climbed into her lap, something in the older woman's face began to soften. "She has Jennifer's eyes," MRS. Stone whispered, stroking Hope's hair with trembling hands. "My daughter would be about 35 now if she had lived. Might have had children of her own." Her voice broke, but then she managed to smile. "It comforts me to know that children are laughing in this house again. That joy has returned to a place that knew too much sorrow." As Hope approached her 2nd birthday, she began saying her first words, and among them was something that both amazed and moved us deeply. She would point toward empty spaces and say, "Friends," always with a smile, always with the kind of pure happiness that suggested these invisible companions brought her genuine joy. Sometimes we would hear her having what sounded like conversations, one-sided from our perspective, but she would pause as if listening to responses, nod her head as if understanding, and then continue chattering in her developing vocabulary. It was as if the 7 children were teaching her, helping her learn language and social interaction in ways that transcended the physical world. Dr. Lewis continued to monitor Hope's development and found her to be exceptionally advanced in areas related to empathy and emotional intelligence. She seemed to understand sadness and comfort in ways that were remarkable for such a young child. When adults would visit our house and become emotional while sharing their stories, Hope would toddle over and offer them her favorite toys, as if she instinctively knew they needed comfort. The house itself continued to evolve as well. What had once felt heavy with tragedy now felt light with purpose. We installed a memorial garden in the backyard. 7 beautiful flowering trees planted in a circle around a stone monument bearing the names of the children. Families would come from hundreds of miles away to visit this site, to leave flowers, to find some measure of peace. Amanda decided to write a book about our experiences, documenting not just the horror of what we had discovered, but the healing that had followed. She wanted people to understand that even in the darkest circumstances, hope could emerge, that love was stronger than evil, that the bonds between parents and children could transcend even death. The book became a bestseller, not because people were fascinated by the gruesome details of Harold Weatherby's crimes, but because they were inspired by the story of how justice had finally been served. How a community had come together to honor the memory of innocent victims. How new life had brought healing to a place that had known too much death. With the success of the book came opportunities to help other families on a national scale. We established the Seven Children Foundation, named after the victims who had brought us together. The foundation's mission was simple but profound: to ensure that no missing child case would ever be forgotten, that families would always have advocates fighting for answers, that the passage of time would never be allowed to erase the importance of seeking justice. As Hope grew into a talkative toddler, she began sharing more details about her invisible friends, though always in the innocent way that children discuss their playmates. She would tell us about Emily, who liked to brush her hair, about Michael, who helped her stack blocks, about Sarah, who sang lullabies when she was sleepy. These interactions never frightened her, and we made the decision not to discourage them. Child psychologists we consulted suggested that Hope had developed an unusually strong connection to the emotional history of her environment, and that as long as these interactions brought her joy rather than distress, they might actually be beneficial to her emotional development. One evening, as Amanda was putting Hope to bed, our daughter looked up and said something that took our breath away. "Mommy, my friends are happy now. They don't cry anymore because they have a family again." Amanda asked what she meant, and Hope explained in her simple toddler language that her invisible friends had been sad because they missed their mommies and daddies. But now they felt better because they had found new family with us. They weren't lost anymore. They weren't alone. They were home. This conversation revealed to us the true nature of what had been happening in our house. The seven children hadn't been trapped here as tortured souls seeking vengeance. They had been waiting for someone to offer them the love and security they had been denied in life. Our family had provided that, and in return, they had become protective guardians over Hope, ensuring that no harm would ever come to another child in this place. As Hope's third birthday approached, we planned another celebration, but this time with a deeper understanding of what we were honoring. We weren't just celebrating our daughter's life. We were celebrating the healing that had taken place in our home, the way love had triumphed over hatred, the way innocence had defeated evil. The party was beautiful, filled with family and friends who had become part of our extended community. But the most magical moment came when Hope blew out her candles. As she made her wish, the room filled with a warmth that seemed to emanate from everywhere at once. It was as if the seven children were wrapping her in their love, blessing her future, ensuring that her path would be filled with protection and joy. That night, after all the guests had gone home, Amanda and I sat in the living room reflecting on how much our lives had changed. 3 years ago, we had been a young couple with dreams of starting a family in a quiet Vermont town. Now we were advocates for missing children, authors, speakers, and parents to a daughter who seemed touched by something divine. "Do you think they'll always be here?" Amanda asked, gazing toward the staircase that led to what had once been a source of fear but was now a symbol of protection. I considered the question carefully. "I think they'll stay as long as Hope needs them," I finally answered. "And maybe, as long as we continue doing this work, helping other families, other children, they'll remain as inspiration, reminding us why this mission is so important." As if in response to our conversation, we heard a sound from upstairs. Not footsteps this time, but something even more beautiful. The gentle sound of children singing a lullaby, their voices harmonized in perfect peace. No longer filled with sorrow, but with contentment, with love, with the knowledge that they had finally found their purpose. Hope had fallen asleep to that ethereal lullaby, and when we checked on her, we found her sleeping more peacefully than we had ever seen, her face glowing with innocence and joy, surrounded by an invisible circle of protection that would watch over her always. The years continued to pass, and our work with the Seven Children Foundation grew into something we had never imagined. We helped solve dozens of cold cases, provided closure to hundreds of families, and changed laws in several states to ensure that missing children cases would never again be allowed to fade into obscurity. Hope grew into a remarkable child, wise beyond her years, but still filled with the wonder and joy that every child deserves. She spoke less frequently about her invisible friends as she got older, but we would still sometimes catch her having conversations with empty air, still see her face light up when she entered certain rooms in the house. By her 5th birthday, the supernatural aspects of our story had faded into the background, replaced by the very real and meaningful work we were doing to help living families find peace. But the love and protection that surrounded our daughter remained as strong as ever, a reminder that some bonds transcend the physical world. The house that had once been known for tragedy was now famous for something entirely different. It had become a symbol of hope, a place where justice had prevailed, where love had conquered evil, where the innocent had found peace at last. Visitors would come not to gawk at a crime scene, but to find inspiration, to see proof that even in the darkest circumstances, light could emerge. Amanda's 2nd book focused on the practical aspects of advocating for missing children, providing resources for families navigating the complex systems of law enforcement and media attention. It became a handbook for hope, showing people how to channel their grief into action, how to turn tragedy into purpose. As Hope started school, we worried about how she would adjust to being away from the protective environment of our home. But our concerns proved unnecessary. She thrived in social situations, displaying the same empathy and emotional intelligence she had developed through her early interactions with the 7 children. Her teachers remarked on her unusual ability to comfort classmates who were upset, her instinct to include children who seemed lonely or left out. We realized that the greatest gift the 7 children had given our daughter wasn't protection from harm, but the understanding of how to recognize pain in others and the desire to help heal it. Hope had learned from spirits who had experienced the ultimate in human cruelty. Yet instead of becoming fearful or angry, she had absorbed their capacity for love and forgiveness. Now, as Hope approaches her 8th birthday, we continue our work with renewed purpose. The foundation has grown into a national organization with offices in 12 states. We've helped solve over 200 cold cases, provided support to thousands of families, and trained law enforcement agencies in new techniques for investigating historical crimes. But our most important accomplishment is the living proof that runs through our house every day. Laughing and playing and growing into a young girl who understands that every person matters, that every story deserves to be told, that love is indeed stronger than fear. Hope carries within her the blessing of 7 children who never got to grow up, ensuring that their legacy lives on through her compassion, her empathy, and her unwavering belief in the power of justice. The house still feels alive with presence, but not the frightening energy of those first nights. Now it pulses with purpose, with the knowledge that it has been transformed from a place of horror into a beacon of hope. The footsteps we sometimes hear now are not the restless pacing of tortured souls, but the gentle movements of guardian angels, ensuring that their sacred trust continues to be honored. Sometimes visitors ask us if we ever plan to leave, to move somewhere without such a heavy history. But this house is more than our home now. It's our mission, our calling, our responsibility to 7 children who trusted us with their story and to hundreds of other families who continue to seek answers. We are the stewards of this transformed space, and we take that role seriously. As I write these final words, Hope is upstairs in her playroom, the same room where we first heard those mysterious footsteps. She's working on a school project about families, drawing pictures of all the people who love her. And if you look closely at her drawings, you might notice that she always includes 7 additional figures, faint but unmistakably there, watching over her with smiles of pure love. This is our story, the story of how a house with a terrible past became a home with a beautiful future. It's a reminder that even the darkest evil cannot extinguish the light of innocence, that justice may be delayed but never denied, and that love has the power to heal even the deepest wounds. The 7 children found their peace, and in doing so, they gave us ours. Their legacy lives on not just in the cold cases we help solve or the families we comfort, but in every act of compassion our daughter performs, every moment of joy she experiences, every dream she pursues. They are with her always, and through her, their story continues. Thank you for watching this video and joining us on this incredible journey. I hope Hope's story and the story of the 7 children has touched your heart the way it has touched ours. If you enjoyed this content, please make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss our latest videos. I'd love to hear from you in the comments below. Tell me which part of this story affected you the most. Have you ever experienced something supernatural in your own home? Or do you have a missing person case in your family that needs attention? Share your thoughts and experiences. Your stories matter to us. Also, let me know what type of content you'd like to see next. Are you interested in more supernatural encounters, unsolved mysteries, or stories of triumph over tragedy? Should we explore other haunted locations, investigate more cold cases, or focus on the psychological aspects of paranormal experiences? Your feedback helps us create the content that resonates most with our amazing community. Don't forget to give this video a thumbs up if it kept you engaged, and share it with anyone who appreciates stories of hope conquering fear. Together, we can keep the memory of these 7 children alive and continue working toward a world where no child goes missing without someone fighting to bring them home. Thank you again for being part of our journey. Until next time, remember that love is stronger than fear. Justice is worth fighting for. And sometimes the most beautiful flowers grow in the darkest soil. Stay safe, everyone, and keep believing in the power of hope.